David Whitman didn't lower his voice when he told his sick wife to leave. Not in the marble lobby, not in front of the concierge who had once called her Mrs. Whitman with respect. Addison stood there pale, one hand gripping the strap of a small bag, while Chloe Bennett rested her hand on David's arm like she had always belonged. No one stopped it. No one spoke. And David, certain he had just removed a burden from his life, had no idea that hours earlier, Addison had inherited something he could never touch. If you believe dignity matters more than power, stay with this story. Tell me where you're watching from and your local time. I read every one. And if stories about truth, consequence, and quiet strength resonate with you, consider subscribing. Before the illness, before the silences grew longer than conversations, Addison Whitman had been the kind of woman people trusted without quite knowing why. She did not speak loudly. She did not rush to fill empty space. She listened, and when she spoke, it was usually to clarify, not to impress. In another version of her life, the one that existed only a few years prior, she had worked in operations for a mid-sized healthcare firm in Chicago, where precision mattered more than personality. She had been good at it. Not visible, not celebrated, but essential. Then came the diagnosis. It was not dramatic at first. A fatigue that lingered, a few missed days. Then tests. Then more tests. The kind of medical language that sounds harmless until it begins to repeat. Treatment followed. Then recovery. Then relapse. Over time, her world narrowed not all at once, but in quiet increments that no one outside the experience could truly measure. David had been attentive in the beginning. He had driven her to appointments, waited in sterile rooms with outdated magazines, held her hand when the doctors spoke in careful tones. He had told friends she was strong. He had told her she would get through it. And for a while, Addison believed him, not because of the words, but because of the way he had once looked at her when he said them. That look disappeared first. It wasn't replaced with cruelty, not immediately. It faded into something less visible, less definable. A kind of distance that made every interaction feel slightly delayed, as if he were always somewhere else, even when he was sitting across from her. Their home reflected that shift long before either of them acknowledged it. The penthouse had always been too large for two people, but in the early years, it felt expansive, not empty. Light filled the rooms in the morning. The city stretched endlessly below them, alive and full of motion. Addison used to stand by the window with a cup of tea, watching the traffic patterns like a quiet study in human behavior. Later, she stopped standing. Later, she sat more often. Then she stayed in one room. Then she began to notice the silence. David's schedule changed gradually. At first, it was late meetings, then client dinners, then unexpected opportunities that required him to travel with little notice. He explained everything, always with a calm tone, always with logic. Nothing he said was unreasonable on its own. That was what made it difficult to question. Addison did not confront him. Instead, she observed. It began with a notebook, plain unmarked, something she had kept from her old work routine. At first, she used it to track her medication, her symptoms, the small fluctuations in her health that doctors often asked about, but never quite captured in full. Then, without announcing the shift even to herself, she began writing other things. Times, dates, the hour David left, the hour he returned, the nights he did not come back at all. She noted patterns, not because she suspected something specific, but because patterns had always helped her understand what people avoided saying directly. There were gaps, unexplained absences that did not align with his calendar, calls he took in other rooms, a second phone that appeared once then disappeared again, charges on their shared accounts that were just vague enough to be overlooked by anyone not paying close attention. Addison paid attention, not with urgency, not with accusation, but with a quiet consistency that built over time. David, for his part, seemed to believe that what was not addressed did not exist. He still transferred money into their joint account. He still signed documents when needed. He still referred to her as his wife. In public settings where it mattered, but in private, His presence became conditional, measured not by time, but by convenience. There were evenings when he stood at the doorway of her room instead of entering. "Do you need anything?" he would ask. The question sounded generous. It was not. Addison learned to answer simply, no. Not because she didn't need anything, but because she understood the difference between asking and offering. The illness changed her body, but it clarified her perception. She began to notice the tone beneath words, the intention beneath gestures, the way David's concern no longer aligned with his actions. He still spoke in the language of care, but the structure underneath had shifted. He was managing her, managing schedules, managing expenses, managing the appearance of a marriage that from the outside still looked intact. There were moments as small, almost imperceptible, when something closer to irritation surfaced. A delayed response when she asked a question twice. A sigh he thought she didn't hear. A glance at his watch while she was speaking. None of these moments would have meant anything in isolation. Together they formed something else. Not hatred, not even resentment. Something more detached. As if he had already moved forward internally, and the life they were still technically sharing had become an obligation he had yet to formally exit. Addison did not try to pull him back. She did not ask for reassurance. She did not search his belongings or demand explanations. Instead, she continued writing. Her notebook grew fuller, pages filled with timestamps, brief descriptions, financial notes, and fragments of conversations. It was not emotional. There were no long reflections, no expressions of pain. Just data, clean, structured, precise. If someone had read it without context, it might have looked like a business log. In a way, it was. A record of change. A record of withdrawal. A record of a man slowly removing himself from a life he had not yet officially left. And within that record, something else began to take shape. Not a conclusion, not yet, but a direction. The kind that does not announce itself with certainty, but becomes harder to ignore with each passing day. There was one entry written late at night that stood apart from the others. No timestamps, no numbers, just a single line. He is preparing for something. Addison closed the notebook after writing it. She did not add to it for several hours. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware and different constant. Inside, the distance between two people sharing the same home had already become something neither of them could cross anymore. David believed he was still in control of the timing. He believed he could choose the moment when everything would change. He did not realize that the change had already begun. And he did not yet understand that Addison, quiet as she was, had already started documenting the end. Chloe Bennett entered Addison's life the way certain dangers often do not, with an announcement, but with repetition. At first, she was only a trace. A scent in the entryway that did not belong to Addison, and never had. Something expensive and floral, too sharp to disappear quickly, lingering in the air long after David had come home and set down his keys. Then there was a restaurant charge on a Thursday evening, a place David had once described as too performative to be worth the price. A week later, there was another. Same neighborhood, similar amount. Then a valet charge. Then an art gallery donation tied to an event Addison had not attended and had never heard him mention. None of it proved anything on its own. That was what made it useful. Addison understood evidence the way some people understood weather. A single gust could mean nothing. A pattern of pressure changes, however, meant a storm was already forming somewhere out of sight. She began recording more carefully, not only when David left and returned, but how he returned. The looseness of his tie on some nights and not others. The faint brightness in his expression when he came home late, which vanished the moment he looked at her. The protective tilt of his phone screen whenever a message came through. The new habit of taking calls in the hallway instead of the study, as though distance from walls made him harder to overhear. He did not know that Addison had become even more attentive since the illness forced her life inward. When the body slows, the mind often notices what movement used to conceal. She had learned the rhythms of elevators, the different footsteps in the hallway outside their apartment, the exact hour the western light turned gray against the glass. She knew when David was pretending to be tired and when he actually was. She knew when his patience was real and when it had been assembled like a face he wore for convenience. The name came later, not from his mouth, not from a dramatic mistake. David was too careful for that, or believed himself to be. It appeared in a forwarded email he failed to fully delete from a shared device he assumed Addison no longer used. It had to do with a charity committee and a media strategy luncheon. There, among polished signatures and event details, was the name Chloe Bennett. The message itself meant little. It was professional, brief, unremarkable. But 2 nights later, a charge appeared for a downtown hotel bar, where the same charity committee had held a private reception after the luncheon. Then, on the following weekend, a florist bill. Same district, premium arrangement. No card listed. Addison wrote the name down. Chloe Bennett. She did not circle it. She did not underline it. She simply wrote it as she wrote everything else plainly, without decoration, without visible emotion. Then she turned the page and kept going. The first time she saw Chloe in person, it happened by accident. David had told her he would be in Boston for an investor dinner, and Addison, who no longer challenged what she already suspected, nodded and said nothing. That afternoon, one of her specialists moved an appointment at the last minute, and the driver's service David's office usually arranged was unavailable. So Addison ordered a car on her own and made the trip into the city earlier than expected. Her appointment ended before sunset. She was tired, chilled, and ready to return home, but the driver took a slower route because of traffic near the river. At a red light, the car paused beside the terrace of a private hotel lounge. Addison was not looking for David. She was watching the movement of waitstaff through the glass when she saw him anyway. He was standing near the entrance with a woman whose posture suggested long practice in being noticed without appearing to ask for attention. Chloe was younger than Addison had imagined, though not dramatically so. Elegant, polished with a kind of controlled beauty that came from discipline rather than innocence. Her coat was cream. Her hair was pinned back in a way that looked effortless and wasn't. She was smiling at something David had said, but it was not a wide smile. It was narrower than that. Precise. A smile designed to affirm, not reveal. Then she touched his wrist. It was a small gesture. Casual, intimate in the way only practiced intimacy can be. David leaned closer when she spoke. Not like a man distracted, like a man relieved. The light changed. The car moved. Addison did not turn around to keep looking. Back home, she sat in the bedroom chair near the window and waited for her breathing to steady. Her body had never responded well to emotional shocks, even when her face gave nothing away. The fatigue came first, then the tremor low in her hands, then the ache in her chest. There was not panic exactly, but something adjacent to it. On the bedside table sat the notebook. She opened it and wrote 5:42 p.m. Hotel Terrace on Wabash. David with Chloe Bennett. Comfortable body language. No sign of hesitation. Then she closed the notebook again. No tears came. That more than anything made the moment feel definitive. Not because she felt nothing, but because what she felt had moved beyond surprise and into recognition. The days that followed sharpened the outline. David grew less careful, though not less deceptive. He no longer over-explained every late return. Sometimes he simply said, "I have plans," as though the category itself should end the conversation. He started dressing differently for certain evenings, not more formally, but with more intention. New cufflinks, new cologne, a new awareness of mirrors. When Addison spoke about treatment schedules, he listened with the distant courtesy one might give a colleague discussing a department no longer relevant to one's future. There was no outburst, no single cruelty large enough to justify immediate confrontation. Only an accumulation of smaller abandonments. He forgot a pharmacy pickup. He sent flowers to the apartment on the wrong day, having confused one appointment with another. He canceled dinner with her to attend what he called a client obligation. Then came home carrying the faint trace of wine and Chloe's perfume, layered beneath winter air. Addison wrote everything down. Date, time, language used, associated charge, possible cross-reference. At some point, the notebook ceased being private comfort and became something more formal. A record, a chronology, the first frame of a larger picture. David mistook her silence for weakness. That was his most expensive error, though he did not know it yet. In his mind, Addison's illness had reduced her world. He believed that because she moved more slowly, she understood less. Because she asked fewer questions, she saw less. Because she did not accuse him, she had accepted whatever version of events he offered. He had always underestimated the force of restraint. Chloe, on the other hand, seemed to understand more than David did. She began appearing at the edges of his life with increasing confidence. Her name surfaced in a guest list for a foundation event David had once attended with Addison. A photograph online showed her in the background of a networking dinner, her shoulder nearly aligned with his. Then came a billing statement for a boutique apartment rental under an LLC Addison did not recognize. The monthly amount was too high for coincidence and too regular to ignore. Addison copied the numbers into a separate section of the notebook. When she was tired, she rested. When she had strength, she organized. She built columns, personal expenses, unusual transfers, calendar inconsistencies, potential third-party links. It gave shape to something that might otherwise have swallowed her whole. One evening, David came home just before 10. He found Addison in the living room with a blanket over her legs and a folder open beside her. For a moment, he looked almost startled to see her upright, alert present. "You're still awake," he said. "I wasn't asleep," she answered. He loosened his coat and looked toward the kitchen. "Did you eat?" "Yes." A pause. "Then you should try to rest more." It might have sounded caring to someone else. To Addison, it sounded like preference, like a request for reduced visibility. She studied him quietly. He did not meet her eyes for long. There was lipstick on the inside edge of his shirt collar. Faint, peach-toned, the kind of mark a distracted man would miss and a careful wife would not. Addison said nothing. David went to shower. When the bathroom door closed, she opened the notebook and added one more line. Visible transfer from concealment to assumption. She sat with that sentence for a moment. Then she wrote another beneath it. He believes this is already over. Outside, wind moved against the windows in long, soft intervals. The city below remained lit, each building carrying its own private versions of ambition, betrayal, fatigue, and need. In one apartment high above the street, a man was stepping further into a life he had not earned. In the next room, his wife was documenting him with the steadiness of someone who no longer needed him to tell the truth for the truth to exist. And somewhere ahead, though none of them could yet see the shape of it clearly, the consequences were already assembling. The call came at 9:17 a.m., at an hour when Addison's days were usually measured in medication intervals rather than interruptions. She almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar New York corporate exchange, and her instinct, shaped by months of managing energy carefully, was to let it pass. Unknown calls often meant insurance clarifications, billing disputes, or administrative loops that required more strength than they were worth. But something in the persistence of the ringing steady, not rushed, held her attention just long enough. She answered on the fourth ring. Miss Addison Carter. The voice on the other end was calm, precise, and unmistakably practiced. Addison paused for a fraction of a second. Carter. A name she had not used in years, but one that still belonged to her in ways Whitman never fully had. Yes. My name is Michael Grant. I'm a senior partner at Grant & Holloway in New York. I'm calling regarding the estate of Miss Eleanor Hayes. The name did not land immediately. Not because it meant nothing, but because it had not been spoken aloud in so long that it had lost its weight in her daily life. Eleanor Hayes existed in Addison's past as a distant figure someone spoken of in careful tones when she was young, then not spoken of at all. I believe there may be some confusion, Addison said quietly. I don't have any direct involvement with Miss Carter, Michael. Interrupted, still polite, but firmer. Now there is no confusion. Miss Hayes passed away 3 days ago. According to her will, you are listed as the primary beneficiary. We've been attempting to reach you through previous contact channels without success. Addison did not respond immediately. The room seemed to settle around her in a different way, not spinning, not disorienting, but shifting, as though the structure of it had subtly changed. I'll need to verify your identity formally, Michael continued. But before we proceed further, I wanted to confirm that I am in fact speaking with Addison Marie Carter, born. Yes, Addison said. The confirmation was simple. It did not carry disbelief or excitement, just acknowledgement. There was a brief silence on the line, not from hesitation, but from recalibration. Thank you, Michael said. In that case, I would like to arrange a secure meeting, either in person, or via a protected channel to review the contents of the will and initiate the transfer process. There are significant assets involved. He chose the phrase carefully. Addison noticed. How significant, she asked. Another pause. Not long. Just long enough to indicate that the answer mattered. Miss Hayes' estate is valued at approximately $500 million, Michael said. That includes controlling interests in Hayes Medical Holdings, several real estate portfolios, and multiple trust structures. The number existed in the air between them, without impact. 500 million. Addison did not repeat it. She did not question it. She did not react in any visible way that Michael could hear through the line. Why me? She asked instead. It was not disbelief. It was sequence. Understanding cause before acknowledging consequence. Miss Hayes amended her will 7 years ago, Michael said. You were identified as her closest living relative with both legal standing and... Hesitated briefly. As she described it, the temperament required to oversee what she built. Temperament. The word settled differently. Addison looked down at her hand, resting against the arm of the chair. It trembled slightly, not from the information itself, but from the effort of remaining physically steady through it. I'll need time to review everything, she said. Of course, Michael replied. We will move at your pace. However, I would strongly advise discretion. News of this nature tends to travel once formal filings begin. I understand. We can arrange transportation, medical accommodations if needed, and any legal representation you prefer. Our firm will support you through the transition. Transition. Another word that carried more than it said. Addison thanked him, confirmed a follow-up call for the next day, and ended the conversation without prolonging it. The apartment was quiet again. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. She remained seated for several minutes, her phone still in her hand, her breathing measured, deliberate. The information did not arrive as a surge. It unfolded in layers. Eleanor Hayes, a name from a part of her life that had been sealed off not dramatically, but thoroughly. Family conversations that had stopped, invitations that had never come, a separation that had never been explained in full, only accepted over time. Addison had learned not to look for doors that had already been closed, and now one had opened not gradually, but completely. She set the phone down beside her and reached for the notebook. Not the page where she recorded David's movements. A new section, a clean page. She wrote, Call from Grant and Holloway, estate of Eleanor Hayes, primary beneficiary. Then beneath it, $500 million. Medical holdings, real estate, trusts. Her handwriting remained steady. The act of writing did not make the information more real. It made it structured, contained, understandable. From the hallway, the sound of the front door unlocking broke the stillness. David. He was earlier than usual. Addison closed the notebook without hesitation and slid it beneath a folder on the table. David entered with the same controlled energy he carried into every space, measured steps, precise movements, the faint tension of someone who believed his time was always being evaluated. You're up, he said, noticing her in the living room. I have an appointment later, she replied. He nodded, setting his keys down. I might be out tonight. It was not framed as a question. Addison watched him for a moment. There was a subtle brightness in him today. not visible to someone who didn't know him well, but present enough to register. A forward-leaning focus, anticipation. He was moving towards something. She knew what it was. She also knew he had no idea what she had just received. "I understand," she said. David loosened his cuffs slightly, glancing at his phone. A message lit the screen, brief, unreadable. From where Addison sat, but enough to shift his expression into something almost relieved. "Chloe." Addison did not need confirmation. "Do you need anything before I go?" he asked. Same question, the same tone. "No," she said. He hesitated for a moment as though expecting more, perhaps a request, perhaps a complaint, something that would justify a longer interaction. When none came, he nodded once and moved toward the bedroom. Addison remained where she was. Two parallel realities now occupied the same space. In one, she was a woman gradually being removed from her own life, managed, minimized, prepared for exit. In the other, she had just become the sole inheritor of an empire built on decades of discipline, strategy, and control. She did not attempt to reconcile them. Not yet. Instead, she reached for her phone again and opened her email. There, as expected, was a formal message from Grant and Holloway outlining the next steps: identity verification, document review, confidentiality agreements, initial asset overview. She read each line carefully, not as someone overwhelmed, as someone assessing. Outside, the sky had shifted into a pale gray, the kind that flattened the city into something quieter, less defined. Inside, Addison began to understand that whatever came next would not be shaped by reaction, but by timing. David believed he was preparing for departure. He believed he would choose when to leave, how to leave, and what version of the story would follow him. Addison closed the email. She picked up the notebook again and added one final line to the new page. "Do not disclose." The instruction was simple, clear, necessary. Because for now, the silence remained her greatest advantage. And while David stepped further into a future he thought he controlled, Addison, without raising her voice, without changing her expression, had just stepped into one that would redefine everything he believed he owned. The day David chose to end the marriage did not begin with tension. It began with order. The apartment was unusually clean, though no cleaning had been scheduled. Surfaces cleared, objects aligned. Even the air carried that subtle stillness that follows preparation not for guests, but for a decision already made. Addison noticed it immediately, not because it was dramatic, but because it was deliberate. She stood near the window that morning, wrapped in a light sweater despite the controlled temperature of the penthouse. Her body felt heavier than usual, the fatigue settling deeper into her limbs, but her mind remained alert, cataloging what had changed. David had woken earlier than she had. That too was new. By the time she entered the living space, he was already dressed, not in business attire, but in something more neutral, controlled, casual enough to appear unguarded, formal enough to suggest intention. There were 2 glasses on the counter. Only one had been used. He turned when he heard her step into the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer uncertain. It was defined. "We should talk," David said. Not harsh, not raised, just final. Addison inclined her head slightly. "All right." He gestured toward the living area, though he remained standing. That detail did not escape her. This was not a conversation he intended to settle into. It was something to deliver. She sat, not because she was told to, but because her body required it. She folded her hands loosely in her lap, her posture composed, her expression unchanged. David remained across from her, not too close. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he began. Addison did not interrupt. "The situation," he continued, "it's not sustainable for either of us." He used the language of balance, of practicality, words that removed emotion from the equation before it could be introduced. "You've been dealing with your condition," he said, choosing the phrase with care, as though naming it directly might complicate his argument. "And I've tried to support that. I have. But there comes a point where reality has to be acknowledged." Addison watched him. There was no anger in his face, no visible guilt. Only a measured distance, as though he had rehearsed this moment enough times that it no longer required feeling. What reality, she asked quietly. David exhaled a controlled release. That our lives are moving in different directions, he said. That what you need and what I can realistically provide are no longer aligned. Another word that simplified something more complex. You mean I'm inconvenient, Addison said. It was not an accusation. It was clarification. David's expression shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in discomfort with the directness. I'm saying this isn't working, he replied. For you, she said. He did not answer immediately. The pause was brief, but it was enough. I think it's better if we make a clean break, he said. For both of us. Addison let the words settle. A clean break. Not a discussion, not a negotiation, a conclusion. And what does that look like? She asked. David moved then, reaching toward the counter where a folder had been placed earlier. He brought it over and set it on the table between them, though not close enough for her to touch without leaning forward. I've arranged temporary accommodations for you, he said. A service department, medical access, transportation, everything you'll need. Everything you'll need. Defined by him. You can move today, he added. Today. Addison's gaze shifted briefly to the folder, then back to him. And this apartment, she asked. David's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. This property is under my name, he said. It makes more sense for me to remain here. More sense. Always the language of logic. Addison nodded once. I see. There was no raised voice, no visible resistance. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across David's face, as though he had expected friction, something that would justify the firmness of his decision. When it didn't come, he straightened slightly. There's no need to make this more difficult than it has to be, he said. Addison's hands remained still in her lap. I'm not, she replied. The sound of heels on marble interrupted the space before David could respond. Neither of them had expected it to happen so soon. The front door opened without hesitation. Chloe Bennett stepped inside as though she had done so before. She paused only briefly when she saw Addison, her expression shifting not into guilt, but into something more calculated. Awareness, adjustment. Am I early? Chloe asked, her tone light controlled. David turned toward her a fraction too quickly. No, he said. It's fine. Addison watched the exchange. There it was. Not hidden, not denied, simply present. Chloe removed her coat, slowly placing it over the back of a chair with the ease of someone who already understood the space. She did not rush. She did not apologize. She belonged here. Or at least, she had decided that she did. David moved toward her, slightly positioning himself, not between them, but beside her. A subtle shift. A declaration without words. Addison took that in, and she looked back at David. This was already decided, she said. Again, not a question. David did not deny it. I didn't think prolonging it would help, he said. Addison nodded. Of course. There was a moment brief, almost invisible, where Chloe studied Addison more closely, not with sympathy, with evaluation, as though measuring the gap between expectation and reality. Addison did not meet her gaze. Instead, she reached for the folder. Inside were documents printed, organized, structured, temporary lease, medical service contacts, a transportation schedule, everything arranged with efficiency, everything decided without her. She closed the folder. I'll need a few things, she said. David nodded, relieved perhaps by the practicality. Of course. My medical records, Addison continued, my medications, and a few personal items. That can be arranged, David said quickly. I'll take care of it, Chloe added, stepping forward slightly. Addison looked at her then. For the first time, not long, just enough. No, Addison said calmly. You won't. The room stilled. It was not defiance. It was boundary. Chloe's expression did not change, but she stepped back. David cleared his throat. We don't need to complicate. It's not complicated, Addison said. I'll pack what I need. David hesitated, then nodded. Fine. Addison rose slowly. Her body resisted the movement, but she did not show it. She walked past them, past David, past Chloe, into the bedroom. The space looked the same. That was the strange part. Nothing had been physically removed. And yet, everything had already been taken. She moved methodically. A small suitcase, medication, documents, the notebook. She paused briefly when her hand rested on it. Then she placed it carefully inside. No hesitation, no second thoughts. When she returned to the living room, David was standing near the door, Chloe beside him, waiting. Addison set the suitcase down. "I'll arrange transportation," David said. "I already have," Addison replied. He frowned slightly. When this morning? Another small shift. He had not expected that. She picked up the suitcase again. There were no final words, no closure, because closure requires mutual recognition. And this was not that. At the door, she paused. Not to look back at Chloe, not to look at the apartment, but to look at David. Just once. "You're certain?" she asked. It was the only question she gave him. David held her gaze. "Yes," he said. Addison nodded. "Then this is simple." She opened the door. The hallway outside was quiet. The same hallway where neighbors passed without noticing. The same hallway where nothing appeared broken. She stepped through it without assistance, without announcement, without resistance. Behind her, the door closed, softly. Inside, David exhaled. Relief. Outside, Addison adjusted her grip on the suitcase. Her body felt heavier with each step. But her pace remained steady. Because what David had just done, what he believed was an ending, was in truth the last action he would ever fully control. The hotel was not the kind that announced itself. It stood between a pharmacy and a narrow cafe on a quiet street just far enough from the city's center to be overlooked by those who preferred visibility. Its lobby was modest, its lighting warm, but restrained its staff trained in the kind of discretion that did not require instruction. Michael Grant had arranged it within hours of their call. Not because Addison had asked, but because he understood the nature of sudden transitions and the importance of spaces that did not amplify them. The car dropped her at the entrance just past noon. No one rushed to assist her. No one asked unnecessary questions. The front desk confirmed her name, handed her a key card, and offered a simple explanation of amenities she would not use. Addison nodded, thanked them, and moved toward the elevator with her suitcase trailing quietly behind her. Her body registered the strain more than her expression did. Each step required intention. Each movement had to be calculated against fatigue. The adrenaline that had carried her through the morning, the conversation, the packing, the departure was beginning to settle, leaving behind the familiar weight of her condition. Still, she did not pause. The room was on the 5th floor. Compact, clean, neutral. A bed, a desk, a chair near the window, and a small kitchenette that suggested temporary rather than transitional. The kind of place designed for people passing through, not for those reconstructing a life. Addison closed the door behind her and stood still for a moment. Silence. Not the curated silence of the penthouse where absence had meaning. This was different, unclaimed, no history attached to it. She set the suitcase down beside the bed and moved slowly toward the chair. Sitting was not an act of rest, it was an act of necessity. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the bottle of water placed on the desk. She took a measured sip, then another. Then she closed her eyes. Not to sleep, to stabilize. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time in that state did not move in clear segments. It expanded, contracted, adjusted to her breathing. When she opened her eyes again, the room remained unchanged. That too mattered. Nothing had followed her here. No accusations, no voices, no version of the past trying to explain itself. Only what she had carried in. She reached for the suitcase and unzipped it. Everything inside had been chosen with precision. Medication first. She placed it on the desk, arranging it in the order she would need it. Then documents. Her medical records, identification, a thin folder of personal papers. And finally, the notebook. She held it for a moment before setting it down. It felt heavier here. Not because of its contents, but because of its context. In the penthouse, it had been a quiet act of observation. Here it had become something else, a record that now existed outside the environment it described. She opened it, flipped through the pages. Dates, times, entries, patterns. Everything she had written still held. Nothing needed to be changed, only continued. Her phone vibrated softly against the desk. An email. From Michael. Subject, initial overview. Hayes Estate Addison opened it without hesitation. The document attached was structured, thorough, and concise, exactly what she expected from someone who had spent decades managing complexity without spectacle. She began reading. Hayes Medical Holdings, majority controlling interest. A network of private clinics, research partnerships, and investment arms tied to emerging treatment technologies. Real estate portfolio, commercial properties in New York, Boston, San Francisco. Residential holdings structured through layered trusts. Liquid assets, accounts distributed across multiple institutions. Diversified, protected, extensive. The numbers were there. Not emphasized, not dramatized, just present. Addison did not react to them in the way most people would. There was no surge of excitement, no disbelief, only a steady absorption. Because what she saw was not wealth. It was responsibility, scale, reach, a system built by someone she had barely known and now expected to understand. Another message followed. A calendar request. Secure video conference. Next morning. Addison accepted. Then she set the phone down again. Her reflection caught briefly in the darkened edge of the window. She looked smaller than she remembered, not diminished, just reduced to essentials. The version of herself that remained when everything unnecessary had been removed. Her gaze held there for a moment, then shifted, back to the notebook. She opened to a new page, wrote, location change, no shared environment. Then beneath it, maintain separation of records. She paused, then added, do not respond emotionally. It was not a reminder. It was a principle. Outside, the street below moved quietly, pedestrians passing without urgency, cars stopping and starting without notice. No one knew who she was. No one knew what had happened that morning. No one knew what she now held. That anonymity was not accidental. It was protection. And for now, it was necessary. Her phone remained still for nearly an hour. Then finally, it vibrated again. A message from David. Subject, logistics. Addison opened it. Short, efficient. I assume you've settled in. Let me know if you need anything else arranged. We should also discuss next steps when you're ready. No apology, no acknowledgement, just continuation. As if the morning had been a transaction rather than a rupture. Addison read it once, then again. Not for meaning, for tone, for omission. She closed the message without replying. The silence she maintained was no longer passive. It was deliberate, because every word she chose not to send preserved something. Control, clarity, position. Another message followed shortly after. Different sender, Chloe, no subject line. Hope you got somewhere comfortable. This doesn't have to be difficult. Addison did not open it immediately. When she did, she read it only once. Then she deleted it. Not out of anger, out of irrelevance. Chloe did not belong in the structure Addison was now building. And anything outside that structure did not need to be retained. Evening approached slowly. The light in the room shifted from pale gray to something warmer, then dimmer. Addison adjusted her position in the chair, her body reminding her again of its limits. She stood carefully and moved to the bed. Rest was no longer optional. But before she lay down, she returned once more to the desk, opened the notebook, and added one final line for the day. He believes I have nowhere to go. She closed it, turned off the lamp, and lay back against the unfamiliar bed. Her breathing slowed, her body finally allowing itself to release what it had held together for too many hours. Outside, the city continued without interruption. Inside, Addison Whitman, quiet observant dismissed, had already begun reconstructing her life with a precision no one had accounted for. And while David settled into the space, he believed he had secured Addison, in a room no one would think to look for her in, was becoming something he would never be able to anticipate. By the third day in the hotel, Addison had established a routine that looked fragile from the outside and exacting from within. She woke slowly, not by preference but by necessity. Her body no longer allowed abrupt transitions. Medication came first, then water, then the measured effort of sitting upright and waiting for the dizziness to pass. Only after that did she begin work. Because that was what it had become. Work. Not grief, though grief moved beneath it. Not revenge, though others might have called it that later. What Addison was building now was structure, a factual architecture strong enough to hold truth without relying on emotion to carry it. Michael Grant understood this almost immediately. Their secure video conference that morning had been brief, direct, and without theatrics. He sat in a New York office lined with dark shelves and neutral art, looking less like a man dazzled by wealth than one accustomed to protecting it from people who mistook access for entitlement. Before we proceed with formal transition, he said, I'd like to know whether there are any active legal or financial vulnerabilities in your current personal life that could intersect with the estate. He did not say marriage. He did not need to. Addison had been sitting at the small desk by the window, a blanket over her legs, her notebook open beside her. Yes, she said. Michael did not react visibly, but something in his posture sharpened. My husband has been moving money, she continued. Some from joint accounts, some through channels I haven't fully identified yet. And there's also a third party, a romantic third party. Yes. Do you have documentation? Addison glanced at the notebook. Some, not complete. Michael nodded once. Then the immediate priority is separation and preservation. We need to keep your inherited assets entirely outside any potential claim structure, and we need a parallel review of what has already occurred in your marital finances. He turned slightly, and another face appeared on the screen as the conference expanded. This is Hannah Reeves, Michael said. Forensic accounting. Hannah looked to be in her 40s, composed and unsentimental, with the kind of attention that moved quickly without becoming scattered. Good morning, Miss Whitman, she said. Michael's given me the broad outline. I'll need access to any records you already have, account statements, saved emails, billing irregularities, screenshots, timelines, anything you documented. I have a written log, Addison said. Hannah's eyes shifted, interested now. How detailed dates, times, charges, absences, behavioral changes. Names, where identifiable. A faint pause. Then Hannah said, That helps more than most people realize. Addison did not find that surprising. Most people remembered feelings. Few remembered sequence. By noon, she had granted limited access to what documents she possessed. Hannah's team would pull publicly available corporate filings and begin tracing any shell structures linked to David. Michael, meanwhile, arranged for a Chicago-based family attorney to coordinate with the estate team, someone experienced enough to understand that high-net-worth divorces often turned on timing rather than outrage. For Addison, the work remained simpler. She sorted. At the desk, she created 3 piles: confirmed records, pending cross-reference, behavioral indicators requiring financial verification. It was the kind of categorization she had once done in hospital operations planning, except now the inefficiency under review was her own marriage. By late afternoon, Hannah sent her first report summary. Not final findings, not accusations. Patterns. There had been repeated withdrawals from a joint account over the previous 11 months. Individually, the amounts were small enough to avoid immediate attention. Collectively, they formed a deliberate drain. Luxury retail purchases, monthly transfers to an LLC registered in Delaware. Lease-related payments routed through a corporate services intermediary. Restaurant charges clustered around David's travel dates. Addison read the summary twice. Then she opened the notebook and added the corresponding dates beside entries she had already made. The alignment was almost exact. Not because David had been sloppy, because secrecy, when repeated often enough, becomes dependent on routine. Another email followed 40 minutes later. This one included the LLC name, North Ellery Consulting. Addison stared at it for a moment, not because the name meant anything, but because it meant nothing. The kind of polished, empty title, chosen specifically to avoid curiosity. Hannah's note was brief. Preliminary linkage suggests this entity may be funding a residential lease and discretionary lifestyle expenses. Still tracing beneficial ownership. Residential lease. Addison thought of the boutique apartment billing statement she had logged weeks ago. The amount, the regularity, the district. Chloe. She did not write the name immediately. Instead, she opened her laptop and reviewed her saved screenshots from the shared account. The payments matched in range, if not yet indirect proof. She noted the dates. Then her phone vibrated. David, calling. Addison let it ring through. A voicemail appeared seconds later. She did not listen to it right away. Instead, she wrote direct contact attempt after financial silence. Then she opened the voicemail transcription. Addison, I just wanted to check in. You haven't responded to my email. We should probably speak at some point practically, if nothing else. There are details to sort out. Practically. He was still speaking as if the matter remained administrative. As if what he had done was an inconvenience requiring management rather than an act requiring consequence. She saved the voicemail, then archived it into a new folder labeled Direct Contact. The next discovery came just before evening. Hannah's team had identified email recovery potential through an old synced device. Addison still possessed a tablet David had once used for travel before replacing it, and assuming its backups no longer mattered. The device itself held almost nothing visible. But metadata and server cache fragments suggested a partial message recovery was possible. Hannah requested that Addison bring it to a secure analyst the following day. Addison looked toward the tablet on the nightstand. It had been there for months, ignored by David, used occasionally by her to read when she was too tired to hold a book. He had never once asked about it, because he had stopped noticing what remained in the room once he no longer valued the person living in it. There was a kind of carelessness in that. Not the carelessness of men who act impulsively. The carelessness of men who believe their assumptions are stronger than evidence. Michael called that evening, not by video this time, but by voice alone. There's one thing I want to stress, he said. Do not disclose the inheritance. Not to your husband. Not to any intermediary. Not until our legal barriers are in place. I haven't, Addison said. I didn't think you had. But he may begin changing behavior if he senses a shift. He already has, she replied. Michael was quiet for a moment. In what direction, courtesy? That drew the faintest exhale on the line. Not amusement exactly, but recognition. Yes, he said. That often happens. Addison did not ask how often. She could imagine. Once men like David begin to suspect they've miscalculated value. Michael continued, they become attentive very quickly. The sentence lingered after the call ended. Not because it was insightful, because it was accurate. Later that night, as the city dimmed outside her window, Addison listened to the voicemail in David's actual voice. It was smoother than the transcription suggested. Controlled, almost warm. No mention of the apartment. No mention of Chloe. No mention of the morning he had stood beside another woman and told his sick wife to leave. Just logistics. Always logistics. She saved the audio to cloud storage. Then she opened the notebook again and wrote, "He is transitioning from removal to management." Below it, after a pause, she added, "Management will become retrieval if threatened." That sentence stayed with her, because by then, she could see the pattern more clearly than before. David had not left the marriage because he was in love. Love might have made him reckless. This was something colder. He had repositioned himself for advantage. Emotional, domestic, financial, reputational. Chloe was not the cause of the betrayal. She was one of its benefits. And now, somewhere beneath all his composure, he was beginning to feel the first movement of uncertainty. Not because Addison had confronted him, not because anyone had accused him, but because systems were quietly forming around him that he could not charm rush or interrupt. Emails would surface, bank records would align, ownership paths would be traced. And in the center of it all is Addison, still silent, still observant, still documenting. By the time she finally turned off the lamp, one fact had become impossible to ignore. What David had done to her was not one decision made in one cruel morning. It was a pattern, a method. And methods once exposed did not collapse from outrage. They collapsed from documentation. The reading of the will was not ceremonial. There were no gathered relatives, no polished tables surrounded by expectant faces, no moment constructed for reaction. Eleanor Hayes had not built her life around spectacle, and she did not allow it in death. The meeting took place in a secured conference room on the 32nd floor of Grant & Holloway's New York office. Addison did not travel. Instead, the firm arranged a fully encrypted remote session, multiple camera angles, identity verification protocols, and 2 independent witnesses present on their end. The process was methodical, almost clinical. Every step designed not for comfort, but for certainty. Addison sat at the same desk in her hotel room. A glass of water to her right, the notebook to her left. Michael Grant appeared on screen first, followed by a second attorney, Laura Chen, and a compliance officer whose role was not to participate, but to observe. Miss Carter Michael began using the name again with quiet precision. We'll begin with formal identification and confirmation of your legal standing. The process took nearly 20 minutes. Documentation reviewed, security questions answered, facial verification confirmed. At no point did anyone rush her. At no point did anyone assume. When it was complete, Michael folded his hands on the table in front of him. We are now proceeding with the formal reading of the last will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Hayes. The document appeared on screen. Structured, dense, unambiguous. Michael read without embellishment. No dramatic pauses, no softened language. Eleanor Hayes had left the majority of her estate, financial, corporate, and intellectual, to Addison Marie Carter. Not in fragments, not in conditional increments. In control, Hayes Medical Holdings, 72% controlling interest. All voting rights transferred upon execution. Real estate assets consolidated under 3 trust structures, all naming Addison as primary beneficiary and sole decision authority. Liquid assets placed in managed accounts with immediate access upon final verification. There were clauses, protective ones, limitations designed not to restrict Addison, but to prevent external interference during the first phase of transition. No spousal claims could attach retroactively to inherited assets. No forced liquidation could occur without her consent. No third-party access could be granted without multi-tier approval. Eleanor had built not only wealth, but insulation. When Michael finished reading, he did not look at Addison immediately. He allowed the silence to hold, not out of respect for grief, but for processing. "Do you have any questions?" he asked. Addison did not answer right away. She had not reacted during the reading, not visibly, but her mind had moved through each section with precision. Control, authority, separation. Eleanor Hayes had anticipated interference, not specific names, but patterns. "Yes," Addison said finally. Michael inclined his head. "The operational structure," she said. "Hayes Medical Holdings, how centralized is decision-making?" At the executive level, Michael did not smile. But there was a subtle shift in his expression. Recognition. "Currently, the company is overseen by an interim board," he said. "However, with your controlling interest, you have the authority to restructure leadership at your discretion." Immediately she asked. "Yes." Addison nodded once. "And public disclosure pending," Laura Chen replied. "There is a required filing window, but we can control the timing within that range." Addison's gaze lowered briefly to the notebook, then back to the screen. "Delay it," she said. How long, Michael asked. As long as legally permissible. Michael exchanged a brief glance with Laura. That can be arranged, he said. There were no further questions, because Addison did not need reassurance. She needed alignment. When the session ended, the room returned to silence. The same chair, the same desk, the same measured light filtering through the window. But the balance had shifted. Not externally, not yet, but structurally. Addison opened the notebook, wrote, "Control confirmed." Then beneath it, "Maintain non-disclosure." She paused, then added, "Proceed with parallel legal action." Her phone vibrated almost immediately after. Unknown number, Chicago. She let it ring once, twice, then answered, "This is Addison Whitman. Miss Whitman, this is Daniel Brooks, Family Law. Mr. Grant's office connected us." His tone was direct, efficient. "I've reviewed the preliminary notes. I understand you're preparing to initiate separation proceedings." "Yes," Addison said. "We'll need to move quickly," Daniel continued. "Given the financial irregularities already identified, timing is critical. Has your husband made any recent attempts at reconciliation or contact beyond administrative communication?" Addison considered. "Yes. In what form? Email, voicemail, neutral tone?" Daniel exhaled softly. "That suggests uncertainty," he said. "Not remorse. Important distinction." Addison did not respond. "Have you disclosed your inheritance to him?" Daniel asked. "No." "Good," he said. "We'll keep it that way for now. Once we file, his behavior may shift again, likely toward access." Access. The word aligned with what she had already written. "Understood," she said. "We'll prepare filings within 48 hours, Daniel added. "In the meantime, do not engage directly. Everything goes through counsel." Addison agreed. The call ended. She remained seated. Still. Outside, the city had moved into afternoon traffic, the distant hum of it rising and falling without urgency. Her phone lit again. This time, a message. "David. Subject checking in." She opened it. "Addison, I think we should talk. There are things we need to clarify. I don't want this to become unnecessarily complicated." Unnecessarily complicated. The phrase carried weight now, not because of what it said, because of what it anticipated. Addison read it once, then set the phone down. A second message followed within minutes. Shorter. "Let me know when you're available." She did not respond. Instead, she opened a new folder in her email, labeled it Post-Removal Communication, moved both messages into it. No annotation, no commentary, just placement. Then she reached for the tablet Hannah had mentioned, powered it on. The screen flickered to life slowly, as if resisting relevance. Old apps, old data, old assumptions. David had used this device once as an extension of himself, then discarded it when it no longer served him. He had assumed what he left behind no longer existed. Addison placed it beside the notebook, not yet examined, not yet processed, but no longer ignored. Another message appeared. Different sender. "Chloe. David's trying to reach you. It would be easier if you just spoke to him." Addison looked at the screen, read it once, then again, not for meaning, for tone. Not aggressive, not apologetic. Positioning. She deleted it, without saving. Because Chloe's words did not hold structural value. Only David's did, and even those were losing relevance. As evening settled, Addison stood slowly from the desk and moved toward the window. The city below reflected itself in layers of glass, against glass light, against light movement, layered over stillness. Somewhere in that city, David was adjusting, recalculating. He did not yet know what he was responding to, only that something had shifted. And because he did not understand the source, he would begin searching for it in the only way he knew how. Control, access, conversation. Addison rested her hand lightly against the cool surface of the window. Her reflection looked back at her. Unchanged, and yet entirely different from the woman who had stood in the marble lobby days before. Not stronger in appearance, not louder, but positioned, aligned, prepared. She returned to the desk one last time, opened the notebook, and wrote, "He senses movement. Then beneath it, "Do not interrupt his miscalculation." She closed it, turned off the light, and allowed the room to settle into darkness, because while David moved toward her, believing he could still shape the outcome, Addison had already stepped into a structure he could not see. And by the time he understood it, it would no longer be something he could enter. David did not rush. That was one of the qualities he had always trusted most in himself, the ability to wait just long enough to appear measured, never desperate. In his experience, timing shaped perception more effectively than explanation. If he moved too quickly, it would suggest error. If he moved too slowly, it would suggest indifference. So he chose the middle. 3 days after his last message, he sent another. "Addison, I think it would be better if we met in person, not to revisit anything, just to finalize details. Let me know what works for you." The language was careful, not to revisit anything. He was already reframing the event as complete mutual procedural. Addison read the message at 7:12 a.m., seated at the desk with her medication arranged in front of her. The light outside was pale, the city not yet fully awake. She had slept lightly, her body still adjusting to the unfamiliar bed, but her mind remained steady. She did not respond. Instead, she forwarded the message to Daniel Brooks and Michael Grant. Subject line: contact attempt. In-person request. Then she closed her email. Silence, once again, was not absence. It was position. By mid-morning, Daniel replied, "Do not meet him alone. If a meeting becomes necessary, it will be structured and documented. For now, no response is appropriate." Michael's response came shortly after. His tone indicates recalibration. "Continue non-engagement?" Addison archived both replies. Then she returned to the tablet. Hannah's analyst had provided instructions, simple step-by-step, designed to recover what had not been intentionally preserved. Cache data, partial sync records, fragmented message headers. It was not elegant work, but it was effective. Addison followed the process slowly, her hands steady despite the fatigue that lingered beneath her movements. At first, nothing appeared. Then gradually, fragments surfaced. Email headers without full bodies. Timestamps without context, but enough. One thread stood out. Subject: lease confirmation, sender North Ellery Consulting, recipient David Whitman. Date 6 months prior. Addison opened the fragment. The full message was not there, but the attachment reference remained. A PDF, residential agreement, Unit 4B. The address was partially visible. Enough to match the billing statements, enough to confirm. Chloe did not merely exist in David's life. She was installed within it. Addison wrote the reference down, cross-checked the date with her notebook. It aligned. Another fragment appeared. Subject: timing. No sender name, only an internal reference. The message body partially recovered. Once she stabilizes, it will be easier to transition. No need to complicate things early. The rest was missing. But the language was not. Addison read it twice. Then once more. No need to complicate things early. The phrase settled into place alongside others. Sustainable, aligned, clean break, practical. They were not spontaneous words. They were a system, a vocabulary designed to remove responsibility from decision. Addison did not pause long on it. She documented, saved the fragment, labeled it pre-removal planning language. Her phone vibrated. David again. This time a call. She let it ring. Voicemail followed. His voice controlled but tighter now. "Addison, I'm not sure why you're not responding. This doesn't need to become complicated. We can handle this like adults. Call me back." The shift was subtle, but present. Less patience, more expectation. Addison saved the audio, added it to the folder. Then she wrote, "Tone shift from neutral to pressured." Below it, "Still assuming cooperation." By afternoon, another message arrived. This time not from David, from Chloe. "David's getting frustrated. You're making this harder than it needs to be." Addison read it once, then closed it. No response, no storage, no reaction. Chloe's role was becoming clearer, not as an independent force, but as an extension of David's expectation of control. When direct access failed, pressure was applied through proximity. It would not work, because Addison had already removed herself from that structure. At 3:40 p.m., Daniel called. "We're ready to file," he said without preamble. "Petition for dissolution request for financial audit and protective orders on contested accounts." Addison listened, not for reassurance, for sequence. Once filed, he'll be formally notified. Daniel continued. "That's when behavior typically shifts again. Expect increased contact attempts, I understand," she said. "Any new evidence?" he asked. "Yes," Addison replied. "Recovered email fragments. Lease confirmation. Pre-planning language." "Good," Daniel said. "Send everything. It strengthens position." The call ended. Addison uploaded the files, each one labeled, each one placed within structure. By evening, the room had grown dim. The desk remained organized, the notebook open, the tablet still processing background recovery. Addison stood slowly and moved to the window. Below, the city carried on, unaware, uninterested. She rested her hand lightly against the glass, not for support, for orientation. Her phone lit again. "David." Message. Short, direct. "Addison, we need to talk. The silence isn't productive." Productive. Another word added to the pattern. Addison looked at it for a long moment. Then, for the first time since leaving the apartment, she replied. "Not immediately, not emotionally, precisely. Please direct all further communication through legal counsel." She read it once, then sent it. No additional words, no explanation, no apology. The response was not a rejection. It was a boundary. And boundaries once established clearly did not invite negotiation. The reply came within minutes. "What does that mean?" Addison did not answer, because meaning had already been provided. Anything further would only reduce its clarity. She placed the phone face down on the desk, opened the notebook, and wrote "direct boundary established." Then beneath it, "next phase initiated." She closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and allowed the room to settle into quiet. Across the city, David stared at the message on his screen, reading it again and again, not because it was unclear, but because it was unfamiliar. Addison had never spoken to him that way, not in tone, not in structure, not in finality. Something had shifted, not emotionally, strategically. And for the first time since he decided to remove her from his life, David began to realize he might not be the one controlling what came next. The bank records arrived in layers, not as a single revelation, not as a dramatic unveiling, but as a sequence of confirmations that built upon one another until denial was no longer structurally possible. Hannah Reeves did not send conclusions. She sent data. Phase 1 summary attached the subject line read. Addison opened the file at 8:03 a.m. Seated at the desk with her medication already taken, her body quieter than usual, her mind fully present. The document began with an overview. Joint accounts, 12 months of activity. Flagged transactions highlighted not for emotional weight, but for deviation from baseline patterns. The first category was labeled gradual extraction. Small withdrawals, $2.500, $3.800, $1.200. Amounts that individually aligned with normal discretionary spending. But over time, $187,000. Addison read the number once. Then again, not for disbelief, for placement. Each transaction was time-stamped, each one matched against her notebook. She turned to the corresponding pages. Dates aligned. Evenings when David had returned late. Days when he had been traveling. Moments when she had been in treatment physically absent from oversight. The pattern was not impulsive. It was scheduled. Hannah's notes were precise transactions executed during periods of reduced co-account visibility, not theft in the dramatic sense. Reallocation, structured, quiet. The second category, third-party benefit. This section was longer, more detailed. Payments routed through North Ellery Consulting, then distributed. Rent, $9, $400 monthly. Location confirmed residential lease, Unit 4B. Utilities, furnishings, retail, high-end clothing, travel expenses, all consistent with maintaining a separate lifestyle. Addison did not write immediately. She let the data settle. Then she opened the notebook, turned to the section labeled Unusual Transfers, and began marking each line, each amount, each date, cross-referenced, verified. The alignment was nearly perfect, not because David had been careless, because repetition creates predictability. And predictability, once observed, becomes traceable. The third category came with a note from Hannah. Potential misuse of access. Addison read more slowly now. This section required attention. Several transactions had been executed from the joint account during periods when Addison had been hospitalized. Times when she would not have been able to monitor activity. More concerning digital authorization logs indicated access through a device linked to her credentials. But the timestamps overlapped with medical records. Addison was not conscious for some of them. Hannah's note was restrained. Further verification required, but pattern suggests unauthorized use of shared access. Addison did not react outwardly, but her hand paused on the page. Not because of anger, because of clarity. This was no longer neglect, no longer avoidance. It was use, systematic, intentional. She wrote access exploited during medical incapacitation, then underlined it once. Not for emphasis, for separation. The room remained quiet. No sound but the faint hum of the building systems and the occasional distant movement from the street below. Her phone vibrated. "Daniel," she answered. "We've reviewed the preliminary report," he said. "This is strong, very strong." Addison listened, not for validation, for direction. "We're adding financial misconduct to the filing," he continued. "Possibly breach of fiduciary duty depending on how access was used." Addison nodded slightly, though he could not see it. "Will that change the timeline?" she asked. "It accelerates it," Daniel replied. "It also limits his ability to reposition assets once notified." "Good." The word did not leave her lips. "But it's settled. Send everything you've documented," he added. "We'll integrate it." "I already have," she said. A pause. "Then quietly, I thought you might." The call ended. Addison returned to the file. The final section, communication correlation. This was where data moved closer to narrative, not emotional narrative, structural, emails, messages, calendar entries, overlaid with transaction patterns. There, a dinner charge. Same night as a message running late. Client meeting. Another retail purchase. Same day as travel delayed. Back tomorrow. And then a sequence. 3 consecutive withdrawals, followed by a message fragment recovered from the tablet. Once she stabilizes. Addison did not need the rest. The structure was complete. She closed the file, not because it was finished, but because it was understood. Then she opened the notebook. New page. Title confirmed financial structure. She wrote methodically, not summarizing, not interpreting, documenting. $187,000 extracted over 12 months. Third-party residential support confirmed. Unauthorized access during medical incapacitation pending verification. Communication aligned with transaction timing. Each line placed with space between. Clarity required separation. Her phone lit again. "David, message. I've been notified by a lawyer." "What is this, Addison?" The shift had come, not gradual, immediate. She read it, then set the phone down. Another message followed. "This isn't necessary. We can resolve this without involving attorneys." Resolve. The word had changed meaning. Before it meant conclusion. Now it meant containment. Addison did not respond. Instead, she opened a new folder. Post-filing communication. Moved both messages. No annotation. Then she opened the voicemail folder. Listened to the latest one. His voice was different now, less controlled. "Addison, I don't understand what you're doing. If this is about money, we can talk about it. You don't need to escalate this. If this is about money." Addison closed the audio, wrote misidentification of issue. Below it, assumes financial motivation. She paused. Then added, still unaware of inheritance. That line remained. Important. Because it defined everything. David believed this was a dispute over shared assets, over inconvenience, over separation. He did not yet understand he was no longer operating within the same scale. Outside, the light had shifted again. Late afternoon, the city reflecting itself in glass and steel. Addison stood slowly, moved to the window. Her body reminded her of its limits, but her posture remained steady. Below, movement continued, unaware, unchanged. She placed her hand lightly against the glass, not for support, for grounding. Behind her on the desk, the records remained open, structured, aligned, complete enough to act, incomplete enough to continue. Her phone remained silent for nearly an hour. Then one final message. David, short, different. Addison, please. No structure, no framing, no control, just the word. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned away, back to the desk, opened the notebook, and wrote control shifting. Then beneath it, he is moving from strategy to reaction. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and let the room fall into quiet. Because what the records had done, what the numbers had confirmed, was not simply betrayal. It was pattern. And patterns, once documented, did not require confrontation. They required presentation. And when presented, they did not argue. They concluded. The audio file did not arrive with urgency, and it did not need to. By the time Hannah's team sent it over, the structure of David's behavior had already been established through transactions, timelines, and partial communications. Yet there remained a distinction between pattern and voice. Numbers demonstrated intention. Language revealed mindset. What had previously been inferred now approached confirmation, not through accusation, but through the quiet authority of recorded conversation. The file came through a secure transfer link, accompanied by a short note from Hannah recovered from device cache and external sync overlap. Quality is partial but usable. Legal team to confirm admissibility. Addison did not open it immediately. She let the notification sit on the screen while she finished reviewing the last set of reconciled entries from the financial report, aligning one more series of timestamps between the extracted funds and her own written observations. This was not hesitation. It was sequencing. She had learned that the order in which information was processed could affect how clearly it was understood, and clarity, once compromised, was difficult to restore. Only after she had completed her annotations did she return to the file. She placed the notebook slightly to the side, though still within reach, and adjusted her posture in the chair. The room remained quiet as the late afternoon light diffused across the desk in a way that softened edges without obscuring detail. Her body carried its usual fatigue, but her focus was intact, narrowed not by stress, but by intention. She pressed play. At first, there was only background noise, movement, indistinct voices, the low hum of what might have been a restaurant or a private lounge. Then David's voice emerged clearer than expected, shaped by the same measured cadence he used in controlled settings. I'm telling you, it's already moving in that direction. There was a pause, followed by Chloe. And she doesn't suspect anything. The question was not anxious. It was curious, almost clinical. David exhaled lightly, a sound Addison recognized from moments when he believed he was explaining something obvious. She's focused on her treatment. Most days, she barely leaves the room. It's not he. He paused briefly, as though selecting the correct phrasing. It's not something she's tracking. Addison did not move. Her hand rested lightly against the edge of the desk, her fingers still. Chloe spoke again, softer this time. And the accounts? They're fine, David replied. I've been careful. Nothing that would raise a flag, unless someone went looking for it. And there's no reason she would. There was a brief shift in the audio, the sound of glass against a surface, perhaps a table. Once things stabilize, David continued, it will be easier to transition everything cleanly. No need to complicate it early. The sentence aligned exactly with the fragment Addison had recovered from the tablet. No need to complicate things early. The tone in his voice was not aggressive, nor was it defensive. It carried the calm assurance of someone who believed he was managing a process, not dismantling a life. Chloe's response followed after a short pause. And what if she doesn't stabilize? The question was incomplete, but its meaning was not. David did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice lowered slightly. Then it simplifies things further. The words were delivered without emphasis, without visible strain, as though they belonged within the same logical framework as every other decision he had been describing. The audio continued for several more minutes, though nothing that followed altered the structure already revealed. There were references to timing, to appearances, to the importance of avoiding unnecessary attention. Chloe spoke less than David, but when she did, her tone suggested alignment rather than influence. She was not directing him. She was confirming what he had already decided. Addison let the file play through to the end. Then she did not move. The room remained unchanged, the light now shifting toward evening, the edges of objects softening as the day receded. Her breathing remained steady, not because the content had no impact, but because the impact had already been distributed across weeks of observation documentation and quiet recognition. This was not a moment of discovery. It was a moment of confirmation. She reached for the notebook, opened to a new page, wrote, "Audio evidence confirms premeditated financial extraction and planned removal." She paused, then added language consistent with prior fragments. Her handwriting remained even. No pressure marks, no hesitation. She did not write what she felt, because what she felt was no longer the most relevant part of the structure she was building. Instead, she reached for her phone and forwarded the file to Daniel Brooks and Michael Grant, attaching a brief message: "Audio file received. Please review for admissibility and integration into case." She did not elaborate. They would understand. Within 20 minutes, Daniel responded. "This is significant. We will verify chain of custody and ensure it meets evidentiary standards. Content strongly supports intent." Michael's reply followed shortly after. "Do not distribute further. Maintain secure storage. This will materially affect proceedings." Addison archived both responses. Then she returned to the notebook. There was one more line to add. "He demonstrates awareness of wrongdoing." She underlined the sentence once. Not for emphasis, for classification. Outside, the city had begun to shift into evening rhythm, the distant sounds of traffic rising slightly as people moved between spaces, unaware of the quiet consolidation of truth taking place in a small hotel room above them. Her phone vibrated again. "David." Another message. Longer this time. "Addison, I've spoken to the attorney. I don't think this direction makes sense for either of us. We can resolve this privately without unnecessary exposure. I'm willing to be reasonable." Addison read it once. Then again. The language had changed. Not in tone alone, but in intention. Reasonable. Private. Exposure. The word suggested not understanding, but concern. Not for her. For consequence. She did not respond. Instead, she opened the notebook once more. Wrote, "Shift to containment strategy." Then beneath it, concern emerging around exposure, not action. She closed the notebook, placed it beside the tablet, and leaned back slightly in the chair, allowing her body a moment of rest. The audio file had done what no confrontation could have achieved. It had removed ambiguity. It had replaced interpretation with evidence. And most importantly, it had done so without requiring Addison to raise her voice to defend her experience or to persuade anyone of what had occurred. Because the truth, once recorded in someone's own words, no longer depended on belief. It depended on presentation, and presentation, when structured correctly, did not need force. It required only timing. As the light in the room dimmed further, Addison reached forward and turned on the small lamp at the edge of the desk. The soft glow returned definition to the space, illuminating the notebook, the documents, the device that had carried more truth than its owner had intended. She looked at them briefly. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with recognition. Everything was aligning. Not quickly, not loudly, but completely. And somewhere beyond the walls of that quiet room, Trived was beginning to understand, not yet fully, not with clarity, but with enough unease to alter his behavior that whatever he had set in motion was no longer his to control. The filing did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in silence. At 9:02 a.m., Daniel Brooks submitted the petition electronically through the county system, a process that required no audience, no announcement, and no immediate reaction. The documents moved from one secure server to another, time-stamped, indexed, and entered into a structure designed to hold disputes without emotion. By 9:07, the case existed formally. By 9:12, service preparation had begun. Addison did not watch the submission. She sat at the desk, her hands resting lightly on either side of the notebook, aware of the moment, without needing to witness it directly. The act itself did not require her presence. What mattered had already been assembled. The records, the timelines, the financial analysis, the audio confirmation. The filing was not the beginning. It was the transition from private documentation to public process. Daniel called at 9:30. "It's done," he said. Addison nodded, though he could not see it. "What happens next? Service will be completed today," Daniel replied. "Once he receives notice, we can expect immediate response, likely through his own counsel. We've included requests for financial disclosure account restrictions and preservation orders. Given the evidence, the court should grant interim protections quickly. Will he be able to move assets? Not without consequence," Daniel said, "and not without detection. At this point, every action he takes becomes part of the record." Addison absorbed that, not as reassurance, as the structure. "Understood," she said. Daniel paused briefly. "There's one more thing," he added. "Given the scale of the financial discrepancies, we may be looking at more than just a divorce proceeding. That will depend on how his responses align with the evidence, but the possibility is there." Addison did not ask for clarification. She understood. When the call ended, the room returned to stillness. The same desk, the same light. But now the process had moved beyond her control. In one specific sense, it had entered a system that did not rely on her silence alone. It would now move through channels that required response documentation and verification from all parties involved. Her phone remained quiet for nearly an hour. Then at 10:41 a.m., it vibrated. "David, call." Addison did not answer. A second call followed immediately, then a third. Voicemail. His voice was no longer controlled. "What is this, Addison? I just received legal notice. You filed for divorce with financial claims. This is completely unnecessary. You didn't even speak to me." He paused, breathing uneven. "We could have handled this privately." There was no reason to escalate it like this. The word returned. Escalate. Addison listened once, then saved the file, labeled it post-service reaction. She did not write immediately. She waited, not for emotion to pass, for clarity to settle. Another message arrived. Text this time. "You're making a mistake." Short, direct. Followed by another. "Call me." Then, "This is going to get complicated." Addison placed the phone face down on the desk. The sequence was predictable. Daniel had outlined it. Initial confusion, followed by assertion, then pressure. She opened the notebook, turned to a new page, wrote, "Service completed." Immediate reaction, confusion, pressure. She paused, then added, "Still framing as escalation." The distinction mattered. David did not see the filing as response. He saw it as an action that exceeded what he believed the situation required, which meant he still did not understand the situation. Her email notified her of a new message from an unfamiliar address. Subject: representation, David Whitman. Addison opened it. Formal, structured. David's attorney, requesting acknowledgement of receipt. Proposing initial discussion. Standard language, no deviation. Addison forwarded it to Daniel without comment. Within minutes, he replied, "I'll handle all communication. Do not respond." She archived the message. The system was now in motion. Not quickly, but inevitably. By early afternoon, Hannah sent an update. Account monitoring active. No significant movement yet. Will flag any attempts. Addison read it. Then returned to the window. The city below moved as it always did. Unaware. Unchanged. That she realized was one of the few constants. Personal structures collapsed. Financial systems shifted. Legal processes unfolded. But the world outside did not pause to acknowledge any of it. It continued. Which meant what mattered now was not visibility. It was outcome. Her phone vibrated again. Chloe, message. Longer this time. Addison, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this isn't necessary. David was trying to be fair. You're turning this into something bigger than it needs to be. Addison read it once. Then again, not for meaning, for position. Chloe had moved from indirect influence to direct engagement, not through David, through herself. Which suggested David's control over the situation was weakening. She deleted the message. Not stored, not referenced. Chloe remained outside the structure, and anything outside the structure did not need to be retained. By late afternoon, Daniel called again. His attorney responded, he said. They're requesting a meeting. Addison listened. Declined, Daniel added. For now. We'll proceed through documentation first. Understood. There's pressure on their side, he continued. That's expected. We'll maintain position. Addison nodded slightly, then. The pattern remained intact, no deviation. After the call, she returned to the desk, opened the notebook, wrote. Attempted meeting request declined. Then beneath it, pressure increasing. Structure holding. She closed the notebook, rested her hand on its cover for a moment. Not out of hesitation, out of acknowledgement. Everything she had documented, every line, every date, every observation had now moved beyond her. Into process, into system, into consequence. Evening approached. The light dimmed. The room settled into quiet. Her phone remained active, though she did not engage with it. Messages continued. Calls, voicemails, all variations of the same pattern. Control attempting to reassert itself, access attempting to reopen. Addison did not respond, because response was no longer necessary. The system would speak, the records would speak, the evidence would speak. And when they did, they would not ask, they would not argue, they would present. She stood slowly, moved to the window once more. Her reflection met her, unchanged, still, composed, but now irreversible. Behind her on the desk, the phone lit again. Another message from David. She did not turn, because she already understood what it would contain. Not truth, not yet, only reaction. And reaction without structure had no place in what came next. The deposition was scheduled without ceremony, yet it carried a weight that did not need to be announced. By the time the date arrived, both legal teams had exchanged preliminary disclosures, document indexes, and formal positions. What remained was not discovery, but confrontation structured, controlled, and recorded. Addison did not travel to a courtroom. Instead, she was seated in a private conference room, arranged by Daniel's firm, the space intentionally neutral, with no distractions beyond a single table, a recording system, and the quiet presence of process. A camera had been positioned at a fixed angle, its purpose not surveillance, but documentation. Everything that would be said would exist beyond the room. David appeared on the screen shortly after the session began. He was not alone. His attorney sat beside him, composed, attentive, occasionally leaning in to clarify phrasing or signal restraint. David himself looked unchanged at first glance. Well-dressed, controlled posture aligned with the version of himself he had always presented publicly. Yet something in the stillness of his expression suggested tension not outwardly visible, but held just beneath the surface. Addison observed without reaction. She had taken her place at the table with the same measured composure she had maintained throughout the process. Her notebook rested closed beside her not because she needed to write, but because it represented the continuity of everything that had led to this moment. Daniel sat to her right, his presence steady, his attention divided between the screen and the documents arranged before him. The session began with formalities: identification, confirmation of roles, explanation of procedure. The court reporter, unseen but present, confirmed that everything would be transcribed accurately and without interpretation. Each participant acknowledged understanding. Then it moved forward. David was questioned first. The structure was deliberate. Establish baseline. Confirm known facts. Then introduce deviation. Mr. Whitman. Daniel began his tone. Neutral, can you confirm that you maintained joint financial accounts with Miss Whitman during the course of your marriage? Yes, David replied. Can you confirm that you had authorized access to those accounts during the time period between January of last year and the present? Yes. Daniel nodded slightly, then continued. During that same period, were you aware of any significant changes in Miss Whitman's health condition that affected her ability to actively monitor financial activity? David hesitated, but only briefly. She was undergoing treatment, he said. There were periods where she was less involved. Involved, Daniel repeated, not as correction, but as reinforcement. Yes. Would it be accurate to say that there were times when she was physically unable to review account activity? David shifted slightly in his chair. I suppose that could be the case? Yes. Daniel allowed the answer to settle. Then he introduced the first document. A summary of withdrawals, dates aligned, amounts listed. Can you explain the purpose of these transactions? He asked. David glanced briefly at his attorney, then back at the screen. They fall within normal discretionary spending, he said. Nothing unusual. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he introduced the second document. The aggregated total, $187,000. Displayed clearly. Do you still consider this amount to be within normal discretionary spending? Daniel asked. David's expression tightened slightly. When viewed collectively, it may appear larger, he said, but these were not unauthorized. Daniel nodded. Understood, he said. Let's look at where the funds were directed. He brought up the third document. North Ellery Consulting, associated payments, lease confirmations, recurring transfers. Are you familiar with this entity? Daniel asked. David paused longer this time. Yes, he said. Can you describe its purpose? It's a consulting structure, David replied, used for various engagements. Daniel inclined his head slightly. Does that include residential lease payments for Unit 4B? He asked. David did not answer immediately. His attorney leaned slightly toward him, speaking in a low voice that did not carry through the audio. Then David said, yes. Who resides at that property? Daniel asked. Another pause. Chloe Bennett, David said. The name entered the record without emphasis, without reaction, simply placed. Daniel continued. Were funds from your joint account used to support that residence? Yes. Was Miss Whitman aware of that use? No. Daniel allowed the silence to extend for a moment, not to create discomfort, to mark transition. Then he introduced the next set of documents, authorization logs, time-stamped, cross-referenced with medical records. Mr. Whitman, Daniel said, can you confirm whether you accessed the joint account on these dates? David reviewed the screen. Yes. Were you aware that Miss Whitman was hospitalized during several of those periods? I was aware she was receiving treatment. Were you aware she was not conscious during at least 2 of those transactions? David's posture shifted again. I don't recall the exact details, he said. Daniel nodded. Let's move to communication, he said. He introduced the audio file. A transcript appeared on screen. Key lines highlighted. Once she stabilizes, no need to complicate it early. Then it simplifies things further. Daniel did not play the audio. He did not need to. Can you confirm that this is your voice? He asked. David looked at the transcript, then at his attorney, then back at the screen. Yes, he said. Can you explain what you meant by simplifies things further? Daniel asked. David hesitated. Longer this time. It was a general statement, he said, taken out of context. Daniel inclined his head. What context would make that statement appropriate, he asked. David did not answer immediately. His attorney intervened. We'll need to review the full audio before providing interpretation, she said. Daniel accepted that without resistance. Understood, he said. We'll return to that. The questioning continued. Emails, fragments, language. Each piece introduced not as accusation, but as structure. Each response recorded, compared, aligned. Addison remained silent throughout. Her presence was not passive, it was constant. She observed David's responses not for emotion, but for consistency. There were moments where his answers aligned, moments where they shifted, moments where absence of clarity spoke more than any statement. Chloe appeared later in the session. Her deposition separate but connected. Her tone was composed, though more cautious. She confirmed the relationship, confirmed the residence, confirmed that financial support had come through David. When asked about her awareness of Addison's condition, she answered carefully. I knew she was unwell, she said. Did you know the extent, Daniel asked? No, Chloe replied. Did you ever discuss timing of the relationship in relation to her condition? Chloe paused. Yes, she said. The answer was not elaborated. It did not need to be. By the time the session concluded, the structure was complete. Not emotionally, legally, financially, logically. David had not confessed. He had not needed to. He had confirmed. Through answers, through omissions, through alignment with records he could not alter. Addison closed her eyes briefly after the session ended, not from exhaustion, from completion. When she opened them again, the room remained the same. But the distance between what had been known and what had been proven had disappeared. She reached for the notebook, opened it, wrote, Deposition complete. Confirmation achieved. Then beneath it, no contradiction strong enough to disrupt structure. She closed the notebook, set it beside her, and allowed the silence to return. Because what had happened in that room, what had been said, recorded, and aligned, was not confrontation. It was conclusion in motion. And once motion began within that structure, it did not reverse. The judgment did not arrive with spectacle, nor did it require a moment designed for reaction. It was issued through the same system that had carried every prior step. Documents reviewed, arguments, evaluated evidence, weighed without interruption or performance. By the time the decision was finalized, there was nothing left to reveal that had not already been established through record alignment and confirmation. Addison received the notice in the late afternoon. The email was concise. Attached final order. No commentary. No interpretation. She opened it at the desk where every stage of the process had unfolded, her posture steady, her movements deliberate. Outside, the city continued its routine rhythm, the distant sounds of traffic and movement unchanged by what had just concluded. Inside, the document spoke plainly. The marriage between Addison Whitman and David Whitman was legally dissolved. Financial determinations followed. David was found responsible for the unauthorized use of joint assets, with full restitution, ordered based on verified transactions. The court recognized a pattern of concealed financial behavior supported by documented transfers, account access logs, and corroborating communication evidence. The residential property, once presented as exclusively his, was reevaluated within the broader financial structure. Its associated value, along with other shared holdings, was redistributed in accordance with equitable division, adjusted to reflect documented misconduct. Protective orders remained in place. David was restricted from accessing or interfering with any accounts tied to Addison, whether past or present, and any future attempts to obscure or redirect funds would be subject to further legal consequence. There was no mention of punishment, no language of condemnation, only outcome. Addison read the document once. Then again, not for disbelief, for completeness. Each line aligned with what had already been constructed through evidence. Each conclusion followed from structure, not argument. She closed the file. Her hand rested briefly on the laptop before she lowered it. The room remained quiet. There was no release of tension, no visible shift in expression. because what had not ended suddenly. It had been dismantled piece by piece, documented before it was decided, understood before it was declared. Her phone vibrated. "Daniel," she answered. "It's finalized," he said. "Yes," she replied. "You should receive confirmation of asset transfers within the next few days," he continued. "Everything is secured. There's no further exposure on your end." Addison listened. Understood. Daniel paused briefly. "You handled this exactly as it needed to be handled," he said. She did not respond to that, because it was not something she had considered while moving through it. It had not been about handling. It had been about clarity. The call ended. A second notification appeared. Michael Grant. A short message. "Estate transition complete. All protections remain intact. You are now fully in control." Addison read it, then set the phone down. Control. The word carried weight, though not in the way it might have before. Control was not dominance. It was stability, separation, the ability to move forward without interference from what had already been resolved. Evening approached gradually, the light in the room softening as the day receded. Addison stood slowly, her body still bound by its limits, though no longer defined by them. She moved to the window. The city reflected itself in layers glass light movement, each surface carrying its own version of continuity. Somewhere within that city, David was also receiving the same document, reading the same conclusions, facing the same structure, but from the opposite side. Not as confirmation, as consequence. There would be no moment where Addison would see his reaction. No exchange, no closing conversation, because what remained between them had already been removed from personal space and placed into system. And systems did not require witnesses. Behind her, the desk remained organized. The notebook closed, the documents filed. Nothing left unresolved. She turned away from the window and returned to the desk, opened the notebook one final time, turned to a new page, wrote, "Judgment issued, structure upheld." She paused, then added, "No further action required." The simplicity of the sentence reflected the completeness of the process. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to respond to, nothing left to defend. She closed the notebook, not as an ending, as completion. Her phone remained silent. No messages, no calls. The absence was not emptiness. It was space, unoccupied, unclaimed. For the first time since the process had begun, there was no incoming demand, no attempt at contact, no pressure seeking entry. The structure had done what it was designed to do. It had removed access, and with access gone, control had nowhere to return. Addison moved toward the small kitchenette, filling a glass with water, her movements slow but steady. She took a sip, then set the glass down and rested her hand lightly against the counter. Her reflection appeared faintly in the surface, unchanged in form, altered in position. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued. She had not exposed David publicly or sought to reverse humiliation with humiliation. She had allowed the process to carry truth forward without interruption, without distortion. And in doing so, she had left no space for denial to survive. The room settled into evening quiet. The city dimmed, the day ended. And with it, the last remaining connection to what had once defined her life, under a name she no longer needed to carry forward. The transition did not begin with an announcement. There was no moment where Addison stood in front of a boardroom and introduced herself as the new authority, no press release designed to reshape perception overnight. No carefully staged appearance meant to establish dominance. The shift occurred in smaller, quieter decisions, each one placed with intention. Each one aligned with a structure she had already come to understand. Her first visit to the Hayes Medical Holdings headquarters took place early on a Monday morning. The building stood in New York, understated in its exterior design, with glass and steel arranged not to impress, but to endure. Inside, the atmosphere reflected the same principle, efficient controlled absent of unnecessary display. People moved with purpose conversations, measured systems functioning without visible strain. Addison entered without ceremony. Michael Grant accompanied her not as an introduction but as continuity. The staff had already been notified through internal channels. Her name had circulated in quiet emails, in structured memos, in formal acknowledgments that carried more weight than any public announcement. There were eyes on her as she moved through the lobby. Not openly, not intrusively, but with awareness. She did not acknowledge them directly. She did not need to. Presence, when established correctly, did not require reinforcement. The executive conference room was already prepared. A long table, documents arranged. Board members seated, each one composed in a way that suggested experience, not only in leadership, but in transition. Michael introduced her simply. "This is Addison Carter. Not Whitman, not anymore." The name settled into the room without resistance. Addison took her seat. She did not begin with a statement about authority. She began with a question. "Can you walk me through the current operational priorities for the next quarter?" The room adjusted. Not dramatically, but noticeably. They had expected direction. They received inquiry. One of the board members, a man in his 60s with the posture of someone accustomed to being heard, leaned forward slightly. "We're currently focusing on expanding our clinical research partnerships," he said, "particularly in long-term treatment programs." Addison nodded. "Which programs?" she asked. The discussion that followed was not immediate alignment. It was examination. Each answer led to another question. Each explanation was met with clarification, not as challenge, as a structure. By the end of the meeting, no major decisions had been announced. But something had shifted, not in authority, in tone. The expectation of how decisions would be made had changed. After the meeting, Michael remained with her in the office. "You didn't assert control," he observed. Addison looked at the documents in front of her. "Control doesn't require assertion," she said. Michael did not respond. He did not need to. Over the following weeks, Addison established rhythm. Not through visible change, through alignment. Departments were reviewed, processes examined. Not for fault, for function. Where inefficiencies appeared, they were addressed without announcement. Where structures held, they were left intact. There were no sweeping restructures, no dramatic dismissals. Because Addison understood something David had not. Control was not created through removal. It was maintained through clarity. Her health remained a constant factor. There were days when her energy limited how long she could remain in the office, when meetings had to be shortened, when decisions were made from her apartment rather than the conference room. But the limitation did not disrupt the structure. It refined it. She delegated where necessary, not out of weakness, out of precision. The organization adapted, not because it was instructed to, because it recognized consistency. Outside of work, her life remained quiet. The hotel was replaced by a residence arranged through the estate, modest, by comparison to the penthouse she had left, but intentional in its design. Light entered the space evenly. The rooms were not excessive. Nothing extended beyond what was needed. She kept the same desk, the same chair, the same notebook, though she wrote in it less frequently now. Not because observation had ended, because it had changed form. One evening, several weeks after the judgment, Addison sat by the window of her new apartment, the city stretching outward beneath a sky that carried the last light of the day. Her phone rested on the table beside her. Silent. Not because there was nothing to say, because there was no one left who needed to say it. David's presence had receded completely, not gradually, not emotionally, structurally. There were no messages. No attempts at contact, no indirect pressure. Whatever remained of him existed outside the system she now occupied. Not erased, but irrelevant. She had not followed his outcome, not out of indifference, out of completion. The need to know had ended when the structure had been resolved. She reached for the notebook, opened it, turned to a blank page. For a moment she did not write. Not because she did not have anything to record, because she no longer needed to translate her life into documentation, in order to understand it. Still, after a moment, she placed the pen to the page. Stability established. The words were simple. They did not attempt to capture the path that had led there. They did not summarize the past. They marked the present. She closed the notebook, set it aside, and leaned back slightly in her chair. The city below moved as it always did, unaware, unchanged, but she was no longer positioned within it in the same way. She had left without spectacle, without confrontation, without reclaiming what had been taken in the same language it had been removed. She had not returned humiliation. She had not demanded recognition. She had allowed truth to move through structure, and when it reached its conclusion, she had stepped forward without carrying what no longer belonged to her. The room grew darker as the light faded. Addison stood slowly, her body still measured, still deliberate, but no longer defined by what it had endured. She moved toward the window once more, looked out, not searching, not reflecting, simply present. And in that presence, there was no need to prove anything further, no need to revisit, no need to hold. Because what had been taken from her had not been restored. It had been replaced, not with power, but with something quieter, something that did not require recognition to exist, and did not depend on anyone else to remain. In the end, what stays with us is rarely the moment of collapse, but the way someone chooses to move afterward. Addison never raised her voice, never tried to rewrite what had happened, and never stood in front of the world to declare her victory. Instead, she allowed time, structure, and truth to carry everything forward until there was nothing left to argue against. There is a kind of strength that does not need witnesses. It does not demand attention. It does not seek to be understood in the moment it is happening. It simply holds its position until everything else reveals itself around it. And when it is over, it leaves quietly unchanged in principle, but entirely transformed in place. If you've stayed with this story until the end, you already understand something important about dignity and consequence. If this kind of storytelling resonates with you, you can let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you'd like to follow more stories like this, where truth unfolds slowly and strength speaks without noise, you're always welcome to stay connected.